Alrighty, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So, once again, welcome to the Three Worlds of Sports Science Conference 2026. Glad to have everyone here with us today, and those of everyone else that'll be kind of joining us as we go on. This event is obviously a collaboration between the University of Pittsburgh's master's program and Hawkin Dynamics. So, we'll have an opportunity for University of Pittsburgh. They're going to speak on our behalf, and then I'll also be helping kind of manage the event today. My name is Kat Moss, and I'm the Director of Customer Success here. So pleasure to meet all of you guys, and again, thank you so much for hopping on and joining us this afternoon. We only do have two speakers this afternoon, but that's okay. We're going to have a great event for you guys here today. The goal of this event is just kind of to bring together a number of people that are in the sports science field or adjacent, and to go over some of the many and all applications that sports science kind of filters in through, kind of all applications that you may know about or may not know about. So a great opportunity to connect. Just go over kind of the formatting for today. Each speaker will go about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll also have a Q&A period for everyone. So again, feel free to use that chat or that Q&A option, and then we will have some questions to be answered afterwards. But to get started, I'm going to kick it off over to Tim Sugamel. Tim Sugamel is the director of the sports science program over at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'll let him kind of lead the way and announce also the scholarship winner that's in collaboration with Hawkin Dynamics. So Tim, I'll let you take the stage and take it from here.
Thanks, Kat. Everyone hear me okay? Good? All right.
Yep,
so as Kat mentioned, I'm Tim Sukamel. I am the director of the Sports Science Master's Program at Pitt. And certainly love to and want to thank Hawkin Dynamics again for their continued support and their collaboration. But I want to tell you a little bit about our program before we get to our speakers. So the thing about our program is we have a one-year Master's of Science program in sports science. And really what this does is combines a lot of the different courses that you would have as kind of a generalist within sports science. But we also want to focus on the idea that sports science is more of a how versus a what. So we have various internships that we have across our program, some with Pitt Athletics, Carnegie Mellon at the Neuromuscular Research Lab, but also places like Duquesne, and kind of ever growing in terms of different areas that people can do their internships. But the other thing that we have also is a capstone project, and that is kind of where the research side comes in, where you can see pictures here on the right of students presenting their research. But a lot of this stems from the work that they're actually doing with the athletes. So this is kind of a true sports science program in the sense that we're using the data that they collect to kind of answer those questions, and using sports science as the how rather than the what, because every single situation within sports science may require a different aspect, whether that's strength and conditioning, data analytics, sports medicine, etc. So we really pride ourselves on our internship. So where our students are currently now, you can see them all listed here within Pitt Athletics, Carnegie Mellon, and the Neuromuscular Research Lab. We've also had students with Pitt Nutrition, but also with other locations like the Pittsburgh Pens Elite, where their hockey development program, like I mentioned, Pitt Nutrition, but wanted to give a shout out to all of our students who are currently in the program, and that we are also accepting students for next year's cohort. So speaking of the next cohort, we have an application deadline of July 15th, and we have ongoing enrollment right now. We are kind of getting higher and higher in terms of the numbers, so we want to make sure that if you're interested in the program, that you certainly apply sooner versus later. There are several prerequisites where we have ex-phys, nutrition, stats, as well as anatomy and physiology. But in addition to that, there's different pieces that you would actually have an essay, but also your transcripts, resume, and actually there's 2 letters of recommendation or reference rather than three letters. And you can certainly visit the program. The link is right here, and that's actually not a live link, so I'll put that in the chat for everybody. But you can also use the QR code that's also listed here. So the who's who, you've been listening to me also on this call, is Caitlin Allison, who is our Associate Program Director, but you can see the other individuals who have taught within our program, or admin with Kevin Conley. And then on the next page, we'll also highlight Dr. Colton, who teaches our seminar in sports science currently. Mitch Kolowinski, rather, is our Director of Sports Science and has direct impact on the internships that some of their students go through. And Aaron Duvall, who's actually our Assistant Director of Athletics, overseeing sport performance. So he sees the Olympic side, football, basketball, as well as sports science as well. So those two individuals really help shape the internship and the experiences that our students receive. So for the last several years, we've been fortunate enough to be able to be supported by Hawkin Dynamics and the Emerging Sports Science Professional Scholarship. So you can see our previous winners here, and each year students apply for this scholarship during the spring semester, and we select one of those individuals so that these funds can be used to support them during the summer term. And our winner this year is actually Guillermo Scali Mendez. I want to say thank you to him for his contributions to this program. And I know that if Guy is on the call, certainly would like to give him the opportunity to say a few words about his experience, but also how this scholarship will help out. So. As I mentioned, when it comes to the program, here's all of our information here, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Guy, if you are on the call, if you wouldn't mind, I'm not sure if he is or not. If you are on the call, certainly would love to hear from you. He's here. Guy, would you mind turning your Kat? Do we have to give him speaking capabilities?
I just did, so he should be able to
Can you
give
listen to
a
me?
shout.
Yep,
Yes.
we got you, Guy.
Hello.
Okay, yeah, I didn't have access before. Thank you.
There you are. Same shirt and
So,
everything.
thank you very much. I'm really, really glad for being selected as this year scholarship recipient. How do I start? This program was like a big move in my life, not only professional life, but my private life too. Moving to another country to come to this program was a bold decision, I would say. I had to change a lot of things in my life, and it was not just for knowledge or for the professional experience at Carnegie Mellon that has been great. I also had some time volunteering at Pitt that gave me a lot of D1 insight, but just the experience of being among the people in this cohort was really great for me, because I think when you are in a room with people who know more than you or who want to go in the same direction as you and are pursuing the same goals, it really pushes you forward. And I'm really glad and thankful for Dr. Sukumel, who's been my advisor for the last year, Dr. Allison, who's also here, and it's a great professor, and all the students of the cohort. The scholarship will be really, really helpful for me, because financially, we know, like, I'm from Brazil, and it's really hard to support my staying here in the US. So the scholarship would be a great help for me. And I also want to get this opportunity to say thank you to the Carnegie Mellon strength and conditioning staff, Alan DeGennaro and Mike Kelly. They are two amazing coaches who mentored me throughout the last year, and it was amazing. It was amazing. I'm really glad, and I hope this is just the first step in my sports science career.
Well, thank you for that, Guy. Really excited to have you, obviously part of the program, and then of course being an ambassador for the program after you graduate. So, moving on with the conference, I hope that despite having the last minute dropout, I hope everyone enjoys the conference. But I know that our first speaker is here, and Kat, you can take things away in terms of introducing. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks so much, Tim, and congratulations to our winner. Welcome on board. So I'll be also reaching out to you as well to do a little intro with Hawkin Dynamics. We're obviously happy to help sponsor that scholarship part of it. But as Tim said, we do have our first speaker here ready to go. So our first speaker is Dr. Nicholas Ripley. Sorry, he is a lecturer of strength and conditioning at the University of Salford. He also has extensive applied experience across a range of sports, including rugby, soccer, lacrosse, swimming, judo, wrestling, and MMA. He also currently works for the British Lacrosse and Manchester United, along with his full-time academic role. Along with the other many things that he does, he also has his CSCS with distinction, his RSCC, and his ASCC with the UKSCA. So a very, very gifted person here. I'm happy to open the stage here to Nicholas. I'll let you lead the way here. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Kat. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, thanks, Kat. Thanks for the introduction, and obviously thanks for Hawkin Dynamics and Dr. Tim Suckermal for the invite. So kind of building on my background is predominantly in terms of academia. I did my PhD in hamstring strain injuries, and looking at kind of how we can maybe manage that, especially with the more integrated technology with force plates and strain gauges. So we're going to talk about kind of that bulletproofing that we all want with hamstrings, but how it also links to athletic performance. And I'm actually going to start here with thinking around performance injury trade-off. So this is where we know that we want to desire a single desired adaptation of enhancing performance, but that comes at the cost of increasing injury risk. And this is common among sport. And specifically within change of direction, we know if we kind of achieve a higher change of direction performance, we increase the risk of injury, particularly knee abduction moments, which can lead to ACL injuries. So we have issues within sport. Similarly with training load, we know we need high training loads to obviously build fitness, build tolerance to load, but especially spikes in training load and high training loads globally increase the risk of injury. So we have these trade-offs in sport, and we can sort of try and link that to hamstring strain injury risks, but I think it's slightly different. It's not necessarily a trade-off, it's a synergy, and it's a synergy around we want to manage performance, we want to mitigate injury risk. So I think the use of the word resilience can come in here a little bit. Actually, we want to maximize those risk factors to mitigate that injury. And why is that important? So we know speed's important. Whether that's looking at someone like Usain Bolt, thinking about that single speed performance, we know the athlete with the highest speed is typically going to win these events. And this has been seen multiple times, especially when you consider speed across that 100-meter performance. But we don't all work in these environments with a single outcome of who crosses that line first. So myself worked in a lot of team sports. And what we know from team sports, and I'll use soccer as an example, is that the key performance indicator of soccer is, can I score more goals than the opposition? And from the research identified there, we can see that the scoring or assisting player is performing a linear sprint over 50% of the time before scoring a goal. So that speed is critical. It's a critical key performance indicator for soccer performance. Even on the defensive side, although there's some contrasting findings between men's and women's, a linear sprint precedes those goal-scoring events. So we need our defensive players to maximize their sporting performance as well. And I was going to try and share a video, but I wasn't too sure on the copyright. But there's a really good video recently where Benjamin Sesko sprints from his own half into the opposition half, scores the goal. He achieves a max speed of 22 miles per hour. That's about 9.8 meters per second. So really, really fast development of speed leading to successful outcome. So we know speed's important. But what about the impact of injury? So in terms of injuries, we have a range of issues. They currently make up around 10% of all injuries. So hamstring strain injuries make up 10% of all injuries, and they've been increasing around 7% annually. So that's quite an alarming statistic. But when you coincide that with the associated cost, which per injury within European soccer is over $100,000, it's quite alarming, especially if you're the top team, you're the Manchester United, Real Madrids, Barcelona's, where it can be in excess of $500,000. So there's an economic cost to these injuries as well. This also is linked to the cost of performance. And we know injuries are linked to decreases in athletic and successful performance in team sports, as well as individual sports. So they have key implications on sporting performance and economic cost of missed matches, missed training sessions, where you're paying wages for players who are injured. The further impacts come in the re-injury rates, up to 50% re-injury rates for hamstring strain injuries, which is critically alarming if you consider they're still increasing and then they're going to likely sustain a subsequent injury. With up to 3 weeks missed training or competitions. And I recently saw Howden release their kind of surveillance statistics and costs for kind of the major European soccer leagues. And across the 5 soccer leagues for the 2024 to 2025 season, the estimated cost for muscle and hamstring strain injuries was over 130 million euros, which is baffling because we spend so much time trying to identify the risk factors, trying to mitigate the risk, but it still costs us so much. So there's some potential implications on how we train in individuals, which I won't touch too much on tonight, but how we train in individuals, but how we test in individuals could be the key to this. So thinking about the mechanism of injuries, and this is why it is the synergy, because the primary mechanism of injury is sprinting and running-based events. So up to 75% of hamstring strain injuries are non-contact, with nearly 2/3 occurring during running-based events. So we've got this clear mechanism of injury being sprinting, because we see this work by Finnan, where they're going into that stride, and we are eliciting the high forces and high strains related to injury risk. And this is being caused by this kind of late swing phase or proposed late swing phase injury mechanism, where we have simultaneous hip and knee flexion, where the hamstrings experience lengths in excess of around 10% of their anatomical resting length, especially for the bicep femoris, going up to about 12% in that late swing phase. But then they're also associated with high rates of work and force. So we can see during maximal sprinting, during that swing phase, during that eccentric, potentially eccentric lengthening, we see in the hamstrings required to produce around 12 times body weight in forces. So there's a real key issue where we're sustaining these injuries because we're exposing them to these high strain rates through high speed running, these high loading forces, as well as then we're doing this repeatedly over a season, over kind of multiple training sessions. But why is it a synergy and not a trade-off? A trade-off would suggest we want to mitigate sprinting, but that's not the case. We know we enhance the modifiable risk factors through sprinting. Through the inclusion of sprint-based training, we can increase eccentric hamstring strength. We can increase bicep femoris fascicle length. So these are modifiable risk factors that, as strength conditioning coaches, we should care about. We also know workloads are a key issue. So Malone's published a range of works associated with kind of Tim Gabbert around training workloads. And if we can develop the physical qualities associated with sprint performance, so sprinting tolerance, strength, sprint speed, we can minimize the risk of muscle injuries being sustained. So again, it comes back to that kind of, is it a paradox? Is it a trade-off? Or is it that we need both to maximize our sprinting performance and mitigate our injury risk? And this is why some kind of authors have started to identify sprinting as a vaccine for hamstring strain injury. That actually, regardless of what we're doing, we need a sprinting emphasis, a sprinting stimulus to minimize this risk of injury. So in terms of these two kind of factors, we have our hamstring resilience. So this is through strength. Muscle architecture should also be incorporated into this as well. But as well as our max sprint performance, and we want to be in that top right-hand quadrant, the resilient elite. They're high speed, they have high velocity running, but they're also at a high resilience to injury. They're very tolerant of these loads. So we know it's that injury trade-off. We know it's that kind of synergy between these two factors. But what's the hamstring's role in sprint performance? If we know sprinting is going to be important for enhancing sport performance, why? So the work by J.B. Morin's identified that the hamstrings have a major role in horizontal force production, especially during acceleration. So that ability to accelerate off the mark primarily through driving hip extension, through that idea of horizontal force production, is going to be critical. And that's what we see in the work by J.B. Morin, followed up by Pierre Samazino as well. And if you look at this work by McNally, we can see that's quite the case, where as we increase the velocities, the forces, particularly in hip generation, increase, that hip extension moment. However, as we reach those higher velocities, as we reach above 8, 9, 10 meters per second, we can see the knee flexion moments increases. So that ability for the hamstrings to resist the momentum of the shank coming through that late swing phase is critical, and is increasing. And it's exponentially increasing in comparison to the hip extension moment. We could further associate this with the work by Hansfield, where we can see that sprinters have well-defined posterior chain musculature, sometimes in excess of 1 to 5 standard deviations above non-sprinters. And only this week I saw there was a paper by Martin et al. That has followed up with this and found moderate to strong associations between specific musculature, including the posterior chain, and sprint performance. So things like the glutes, the hamstrings, the gastrocnemius, and soleus have relationships to sprint performance. So why do we actually need hamstring strength for athletic performance and not just mitigating injury risk? So Dawn et al. Identified that within that swing phase, the force production required is anywhere from about 9 times body weight. So again, we need to be able to produce extremely high forces during that late swing phase. And if we look into the work by Ken Clark and colleagues and Wayand, we can see that the actual forces being produced on that stance phase, especially in the first 50% of the stance phase, determine injury risk. Determine sprinting performance. So again, we've got these characteristics where we need to produce extremely high forces during sprinting to maximize sprint performance. When we consider the role of the lower limb musculature, the interlimb coordination, particularly of the muscle groups, of the kind of ipsilateral muscle groups, thinking the contralateral muscle groups between the rectus fem and the glute max, and the bicep fem, sorry. We know that kind of the switching and the scissoring action required during these high speed running is critically fast. It's so rapid. So we don't just need these high forces, we need rapid forces as well. And the switching and scissoring action identified by Kakihata is really important. So we need high forces, but we also need rapid force production as well. So recent work by Al has followed this around and kind of identified how eccentric hamstring strength relates to sprint performance. And in elite sprinters, eccentric hamstring strength, assessed by the gold standard of isokinetic dynamometry, explains anywhere from 30 to 40% of top speed. So that's very clear cut, as in we need to be eccentrically strong to maximize sprint performance. However, recently, one of my PhD students, Charlie Owen, who works at Manchester United, looked at two different assessments. So he's looked at the Nordic. The Nordic is the field-based assessment of eccentric hamstring strength, and found strong associations in academy soccer players with early acceleration times. So absolute Nordic force at 5 meter time points. So you see really good association there. However, that association wasn't continued at higher distances or max speed. It was actually an isometric prone assessment using the Nord board again that showed a stronger relationship with maximum speed. So we can actually start to identify that different strength assessments share different associations with sprint performers. So we might actually need to include different assessments and different training modalities to maximize sprint performance. So thinking about those strength assessments, I've introduced kind of two there, being kind of a eccentric assessment and an isometric assessment. And where I'm going to kind of pitch this is at field kind of assessments. It's great. I work in a great lab that's got 2 isokinetic dynamometers, but in a lot of environments, we don't have those. They're also not actually that usable. They're not portable. We can't use them frequently enough. So in terms of our field-based assessments, we can look at these two kind of ends of the spectrum. We can have our eccentric assessments, such as the Nord board. So this really is an assessment of structural capacity. It's not a neurological kind of capacity because eccentric actions possess different kind of neural features, but it's an assessment of how much that muscle can resist deformation during that resisted lengthening. So for me, the eccentric assessment through the Nord board is an assessment of structural capacity. Whereas when we consider an isometric assessment, it is more internal function. Especially if we look at specific time points, early time points, we might consider some neurological kind of explosive actions in there as well. So if we think about our eccentric assessments first, unfortunately, as with any field-based assessment, it maybe doesn't match up to gold standard. And the work by Weisinger highlights this, is that eccentric assessments assessed by either Nordic or isokinetic dynamometer are potentially divergent estimations of eccentric hamstring strength. So using a field-based measure maybe doesn't always align to a lab-based gold standard, but again, we work in the confines of the field. We know it works. We know the evidence is there. Similarly, Van Dijk found very similar findings in a large cohort of soccer players, where we see there's not really a relationship between the kind of peak torque achieved at 60 degrees per second or the Nordic eccentric force during a Nordic exercise. However, this is likely because during a Nord board, a lot of people, we don't treat the data effectively. We know body mass is going to be implicated in the Nordic. We know heavier athletes are going to produce higher forces because they're heavier. It's an assessment of body mass. But because of the lever system within the Nordic hamstring exercise, we know increased body height also increases Nordic force. So the treatment of data is really important. And Charlie Owen has really kind of done quite well with this, identifying both the role of ratio scaling, so looking at dividing it by body mass, and allometrically scaling using specific components. And this is critically important to monitor over time, to monitor changes and look at differences between populations. So maybe eccentric assessments need slightly more thought than just using the absolute value. And unfortunately, a lot of individuals only use, and a lot of researchers only use the absolute value. And that is a really under kind of representation of what that data shows. We probably are all likely aware, Nordics, they're not actually that nice to do, and the compliance is normally quite low. So this is because either we maximize that force production during that single effort and we don't do it again for another couple of weeks, Or in a lot of the research, it's shown we do high volumes of work during Nordic hamstring exercise? Or is it the case that actually, if we're using something like the Nord board and we give them that immediate feedback, that they're putting in more effort? So there's a couple of reasons why it might lead to that muscle soreness. But we know the work from Fergal Bian identified that low regular doses minimize muscle soreness. So a very low dose, maybe one set of 3 to 4 reps, even using the Nord board, minimizes the muscle soreness. So we can do it regularly. So this might start to feature and should probably feature more so in practice. Hadou published a really nice piece of research which really started to identify a minimum effective dose for the Nordic hamstring exercise, identifying one set of 3 once per week. This led to a decrease in the risk of injury by 2.7 times and a 15% in eccentric hamstring strength. So one set of 3 once per week doesn't sound very much, but they still had over 50% of their participants, of their soccer players, as low compliant. So it's not obviously an effective modality, but they did, the ones that were compliant to this, which was around about above 75% compliance, increased eccentric hamstring strength and decreased injury risk. And the reason I call that a minimum effective dose is because it still maintained a maximized and improved performance. Some recent work from a student here at the University of Salford has kind of started to work on his own dissertation for this. And I feel like this volume here, so 2 sets of either 1 or 2 repetitions, is more of a minimum retention dose. So as you can see across the season, there's not really much change in eccentric hamstring strength. And this is in professional footballers. So the only kind of slight variability you see is maybe during the Christmas period or maybe the periods of high fixture congestion. But that auto-regulation, maybe going from 2 sets of 1 to 2 sets of 2, provides really good evidence that it is a retention dose. It's the minimum dose required to maintain our eccentric hamstring strength, which we know is a modifiable risk factor for injury. Another issue with eccentric exercises and using something like the Nord board is it gives you a single value. It gives you the absolute force being registered by those strain gauges. Whereas isometric assessments give us more information. We can look at both peak and rapid force production. We can look at different muscle angles, different muscle tendon unit lengths, which has implications on the performance of the task. And these are just a couple of examples. However, with the emergence of force plate, kind of readily available force plate technology such as Hawkin dynamics, as well as now the inclusion of things like the true strength and the strain gauge that offers more portability, new protocols are always emerging. And typically they lack standardization. And this is a key limitation within a lot of the isometric assessments, is when you look at the research, look at the standardized practices. As you can see across these pictures, there's a range of different muscle and joint angles used. There's a range of different protocols in terms of fixation, in terms of using different supports. So there is definitely some limitation of using these. So if we start to think about practical questions around using isometric assessments, particularly using force plates, is can we replicate these tests? And in the most part, yes, we can. They are pretty replicable. When we think about kind of assessments such as the 90-90, 30-30 and 90-20, which is referring to the degrees of hip flexion and knee flexion, we can see they're pretty well standardized. We can start to look at the work by Adam Sund, one of my other PhD students, who's recently published on the long lever bridge, as well as then some of the work by Goodwin and Bull. There are limitations with all of these, with the different angles. For instance, the work in the 90-20 around potentially is it knee flexion or a hip extension task. And if we consider the work by Gorman et al., how that's really being applied in an appropriate kind of force production way is pretty limited. Are they useful? On the most part, yes, they are. We know they're sensitive to fatigue. So from a fatigue monitoring aspect, they're crucial and maximizing their usefulness. We know we can monitor over time through different training interventions, through return to play strategies, and we can potentially use them for talent ID and benchmarking. The reliability is a little bit mixed though. Some of that is there's just not enough evidence, but some of it is what is being published isn't that useful. And I'll kind of show you a little bit more of that later. So reliability is a little bit mixed. And that's the same with normative data. There's only one study, and that's one of my own, that's been published on normative data using the isometric hamstring assessments. And obviously more needs to be done in this space around this, especially when we consider the different assessment types. But thinking more towards that standardization. I published a standardization paper last year, and there is some respect that it's probably a bit early to give a standardization paper. It was more of a narrative piece around, actually, this is probably what we know, but we've got more questions. But what we know is that position has an effect. We know the different positions, so we see there the three most common positions used being the 90-20, 90-90, and 30-30. Each position affects the force time characteristics. So we know peak and rapid force changes dependent on the position. But we also know the different positions change the muscle activation. So when we consider hamstring strain injuries that typically are more related to lateral components, so the bicep femoris long head, we might consider using something like a 30-30, which is going to lead to greater activation of that muscle during that test. So there's potential positional differences which might have implications on injury rehabilitation, as well as then injury screening. Instructions. So we know commonly with isometric assessments based off the work from Maffioletti that the instructions that we give to our participants impacts the performance of the test. If I tell you to push as hard as you can or pull as hard as you can, your peak force is going to be really high, but your rapid force isn't going to be that good. If I tell you to do it as fast as you can, your peak force is going to be drastically lower, while your rapid force is likely going to be higher and more reliable. And this is one of the areas that we don't know currently in terms of the research. So we don't yet really know around the cueing of rapid and maximal force production, but it's definitely an avenue for future research. What we do know based off the work from Rasp et al. Is the orientation and the action of the cue impacts the force production. It also impacts the potential sensitivity of the test. So looking at the 90-20 assessment, we know if we cue for a combination of both hip extension and knee flexion, the test becomes more sensitive to fatigue in comparison to maybe a vertical only cue. So again, the cueing of these assessments is crucial in making sure they are usable in practice. The three tests identified on this slide kind of show no fixation, but there's going to clearly be an implication of fixation. Whether we integrate hip extension into that task, so the work from Adam Sund looking at the long lever bridge, which includes the use of kind of a loaded bar to fix the hips down, is going to have an impact in comparison to something with less fixation or no fixation, such as the 90-90 or 30-30. However, it's likely test dependent. It's also going to be, do you have that availability? Fixation's brilliant if you have it, but some of the areas when we've gone out and done testing, we've been in changing rooms. We've been on the side of a pitch in one instance, and we're doing these assessments quickly and rapidly to do them. But I can't bring a barbell with me and a couple of 100 kilos of weights to mitigate that. So fixation definitely has kind of an impact on performance, but there's limited evidence, and it's probably more dependent on where you sit and your own environment. And finally, familiarity. And again, I'll shout out Adam Sund again. Showed that kind of there was minimal effect with some tests for familiarity, but there might be some benefit. What we see is a lot of these tests are quite reliable, and as with most isometric assessments for peak force, really reliable. So again, it might not be necessary to do long familiarization periods, but we can definitely maybe integrate it into training to maximize performance. So if we consider these two field-based assessments and we look at them kind of more holistically, we should be probably embedding both of them. And the reason is there's no association between them. They're potentially testing different constructs. We see the minimal relationship between the 90-20 and the Nordic hamstring exercise. So we definitely maybe want to include an assessment of both at some point, if we think about soccer players, within the season, and manage it. Use the isometric assessment for something that is less fatiguing, less fatigue kind of inducing, less muscle soreness. So that might be purely for fatigue monitoring. Whereas the eccentric assessment might be more for injury screening. And this is definitely supported by the work from Timmins and Opar and a few others, where we see that the eccentric assessment through the NORD board is still the most evidence-based characteristic we have for monitoring injury risk. So we can see there the work on the left-hand side identifies, regardless of previous hamstring strain injury or not, if we are stronger, we're going to be at a lower risk of injury. Contrasting that, the work from kind of David Opar's kind of identified there's potential implications on the screening of future hamstring strain injury, that it is beneficial, but it still maybe needs something else as well. And that's potentially where isometric assessments might fit. Especially when we consider the recent work by Breed et al., where actually they looked at basically everything from running load, eccentric strength, muscle architecture, and they identified that it was multiple metrics that had the greatest association with injury risk. So again, it might not just be eccentric strength we need to assess, but also isometric strength, and potentially trying to look at how that maybe changes through the season. As we know, eccentric strength typically reduces through the season, especially for those with a previous hamstring strain injury. But what about isometric assessments? So isometric assessments are obviously really usable. They can be performed rapidly, but one of the questions identified is, are they reliable? And I said it's mixed, and it really is. When we think about reliability, we need to make sure we're considering either absolute reliability, which is important for monitoring purposes, for the variance, to make sure when we're assessing changes over time, we're measuring above the typical error. Whereas relative reliability is more focused around benchmarking and talent ID. So for the purpose of your isometric assessment, we need to make sure it's got the right level of reliability. So if we look at the range of assessments identified on the left-hand side, and this has been adapted from one of my studies, we can see that for peak force, for most of these assessments, it's typically reliable, with good reliability that would be acceptable in both absolute and relative. Whereas rapid force is a little bit more mixed. There's some missing evidence, so there's still research that needs to be performed in these, but we can see that we can get really good picture of an individual's variance and benchmarking using isometric assessments. The one I want to point out here is Gorman et al. With the 90-40 in that kind of supine position. And the reason I want to put that out as mixed evidence is they only looked at peak force, but they only identified one limb as being reliable. The other limb was not reliable. So again, we need to really look and kind of critically evaluate some of these assessment types to ensure that it's telling us what we need it to tell us. Because if I was going to implement the 90-40, but we can only say it's reliable on one limb, well, that means we can only use really one limb to either monitor fatigue or benchmark against. And as I said before, the isometric assessments are usable. They are sensitive to fatigue. And they're typically sensitive to fatigue for up to 48 and 72 hours post-fatiguing activity, whether that's kind of within the research, a soccer match or a simulated soccer match. But what we see is divergent characteristics dependent if we look at rapid or peak force. Peak force is typically decreased for up to 48 hours post-fatigue and activity, whereas rapid force is decreased for 72 hours. And if we think all the way back when we're thinking about the purpose of peak and rapid force, to monitor that sprint performance, to maximize that sprint performance, to mitigate the risk of injury as we're going through that terminal swing phase, we need to produce those high forces rapidly. And 3 days post-fatigue and activity, if we're still decreased in these kind of rapid force characteristics, we're still exposed to a higher risk of injury. The interesting finding here is the difference between the different test assessments, that actually the 30-30 was returned to baseline within 48 hours. So the different muscle tendon unit lengths likely lead to different sensitivities. So we potentially also need to consider the muscle tendon unit length being used and the sensitivity of that test with the metric. And I know Adam Sunder's got more data on this to come out on the usability of different assessments. So the last kind of bit of this presentation is I want to use some examples. I want to give you guys some examples of kind of how I've used it in my practice and practice of others. So the Chief Products Officer at Hawkin Dynamics, Dr. John McMahon, I'll give him a shout out. He was my PhD supervisor, and he'll always tell me about his time in the Royal Marines, in the military, and he was really good at coming up with acronyms. And one of the acronyms he identified as part of kind of using isometric assessments was an acronym named BRIEF. And BRIEF stood for Benchmarking and Talent ID, Return to Sport, Injury Screening, Exercise Prescription, and Fatigue Management. So to keep the trend going, I want to use these kind of 5 characteristics of training and purposes for using them, for using isometric assessments, and report back to you guys. So in the first instance, for benchmarking. So this is the only study that's currently available using or presenting normative data on isometric assessments. So this is from approximately around 140 professional soccer players here in England, where we have normative data. And what we identified is when we ratio scaled the data, so when we divided it by body mass, there was trivial differences. The effect sizes were basically naught. So what we did with that, we could pull all those different positions into a single data set. And that allowed the development of T-scores and these normative values to benchmark against. So this allows you to identify training needs, identify potential weaknesses, whether that's looking at weaknesses between positions or between limbs. And just this week, actually yesterday, a second study has just been published using soccer players again, smaller cohort, but looking more at rapid force and how it relates to peak force. We know from my early work in 2023 is there's a pretty good relationship between rapid force and peak force within isometric hamstring assessments. And this is typically consistent across a lot of isometric assessments. But what we found was that there was little consistency between positions. So in our larger positional groups, what we see is that the midfielders typically produce more of their peak force in those early time points than the other positions. So we can see at 100 and 200 milliseconds, they're producing a little bit more than their counterparts. So these positional differences might be indicative of kind of different training mechanisms, different training modalities, different training purposes. So definitely something to consider as a kind of measure of injury and performance needs. So moving on to the next case study. So we identified return to sport as one of the purposes of using isometric assessments. So this case study revolves around a youth female soccer player, ACL injury. So we know female soccer players are at an increased risk of injury, especially lower limb injuries and especially in matches. So this soccer player kind of followed on from the work from Matt Taberner, but was based in a youth athlete. And we can see during their kind of return to play guidance, what we kind of went through is that early rehabilitation phase, a return to participation, so starting to reintroduce into the team setting, but not playing games at this point, a return to sport, so actually return to competitive matches for the club, and then return to performance. And that return to performance coincided with selection for the national team at her age group. So performing the 90-90 and 30-30 across this return to play. So if we look at how peak force changes, so we can see as you move through those different time points, we can see there's large discrepancies between limbs, but as we get closer to that return to performance, it does start to reduce. But we can see anywhere from 20 up to 60% improvement between that return to play or return to participation through to return to performance. So we can see it's a really good monitoring tool to make sure that we're decreasing the risk of injury. However, when we looked at the rapid force characteristics, there is an issue, especially within the 90-90, there were still large asymmetries. And what we looked at is when we normalize rapid force to peak force, as identified in one of the previous slides, is the injured limb only accounted for around 50 to 60% of her rapid force when made relative to a peak. Whereas the uninjured limb was producing between around 80% of her peak force in that first 100, 200 milliseconds. So that identifies there's a key issue. And if we think around ACL injuries, the role of the hamstring is to prevent anterior tibial translation. We know they're going to occur in around 100 to 200 milliseconds, especially in the mechanisms of turning and landing. So to have a lower percentage of her peak force being produced in that first kind of 100, 200 milliseconds for the injured limb compared to the uninjured limb potentially highlights that there's still an elevated risk of injury. And this is actually quite consistent across the research, where we know that rapid forces typically remains lower and rate of force development remains lower in the injured limb post, particularly ACL, for a lot longer than peak force. So injury screening. So we know the Nordic hamstring exercise is kind of the best evidence we currently have. But in terms of isometrics, there's not really been much published on this. The only real study we have currently is the work by Driggers et al. So Driggers, within professional baseball players, identified a threshold of 406 newtons using an isometric assessment as demonstrated there by Dr. Chris Bremer. Generally, quite a good test. Their isometric assessment sensitivity to injury was 80%, so that's pretty accurate. However, the sensitivity, the accuracy of the assessment wasn't that good. If we think about the area under the curve, it was only about 0.6, which is only partially better than flipping a coin. So although there was high sensitivity, there's potentially low accuracy, despite the elevated risk of 2.17 times. So there's potentially more work needs to be done. And I think this really kind of is a nice common theme throughout this presentation, is that we can't just use one assessment type or one assessment design. We need to use multiple assessments. We need to consider muscle structure and running mechanics when we look at injury screening, running loads when we look at injury screening. That single kind of test is not going to be the golden bullet that tells us, brilliant, you're at a low risk or a high risk of injury. But we need to look at it more holistically, which I think is where a lot of the evidence is starting to point to. So in terms of exercise prescription, so one of the clubs we work with is a rugby league club. And for those that don't know rugby league, it's more of a northern-based sport, northern England, a lot of physical contact, a lot of high-intensity running. And working with Oldham Rugby League, we did their pre-season testing in around November time. And if we look at the left and right forces, we plotted it in a simple quadrant for the team. And what the coach did with this, based off the average, very simply used kind of very simple heuristic to identify training needs. So if they were weak, so if they featured in this bottom left-hand corner, so if their peak force was less than 340 newtons, they did isometrics. They did isometric assessments in that position. So there is kind of some suggestion that actually they're only training at a short muscle length. They may be just training for the test, but that's what they did. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but based off that lower limb corner, bottom left corner, they're weak. They did isometrics, particularly in that 90-90 position. If they were strong, so if they were above 340 newtons, they performed the Nordic. So again, there's potential consideration there that actually, because they're strong, they can tolerate those forces. They can potentially move through the Nordic, go through in an eccentric action, which is not very common if we look at some of the research when we use dynamic ultrasound on the hamstrings, is that the hamstrings typically shorten and remain in an isometric state. There is some kind of work from myself that started to identify when they start to go into an eccentric muscle lengthening is typically those that are stronger. So for the strong athletes, they perform the Nordic. However, for the athletes with large asymmetries, and they used a value of 10% for this, they perform unilateral slides. So again, focused on that unilateral limb, that single limb, to maximize their performance, to minimize that injury risk. And if we look at their kind of mid-season testing results, we can see for peak force, definitely worked. There's a clear improvement in peak force from pre-season to in-season, which again isn't that common when we think about some of the research published, some of the research presented here today, as well as others being published. Interestingly, the variance in the limb differences did increase. So we can see there's a lot there moving maybe from around 20-25% plus or minus up to maybe 30-35%. However, I'm less concerned with the asymmetry. I know there's thresholds of 10-15% that might identify an increased risk of injury, but we've made them all stronger. On average, there's been an 80 Newton increase in that peak force. So that 80 Newton increase has definitely improved. So they're stronger, so they should be at a lower risk of injury, despite the increased asymmetry. And then finishing off, we're going to look at fatigue management. And again, moving to another sport, we're going to move into lacrosse now. So I work specifically with the newer version of lacrosse being sixes. So current tournament formats are 2 to 3 matches per day over a 3 to 5 day window. And we know they include a lot of high intensity efforts and including accelerations and particularly decelerations, which are the muscle kind of fatiguing elements, especially for the quads and the hamstrings. There's not really as many entries into top speed, but we do get a lot of acceleration demands. So based off pre and post, what we can see is we reduce, we get worse, you're fatigued. But what we can see is it's very individual on how people fatigue. Whether it's reductions in peak force, whether it's reductions in rapid force, where peak force is almost maintained a little bit. So if we think about this athlete here, his peak force was really high. He's really strong, around that 500 Newtons mark, which if we compare that to some of the normative benchmarks, he's going to be in the very good to excellent. But his rapid force went from close to 80% to around about 10% of what he could produce. And this is a clear issue that he's gone from being able to produce quite a lot of his force very rapidly, potential implications on improving his sprint performance, improving his acceleration and deceleration demands, and mitigating risk of kind of knee ligament injuries, to basically not being able to produce anything rapidly, which is likely to decrease his risk of injury, increase his risk of injury, sorry. And one of my colleagues, Richie Barber, I kind of identified this kind of ability to look at individual fatigue profiles, potentially look at how people change, Do they decrease their peak force, which could be more structural? Or do they decrease their rapid force, which could be associated with more neurological peripheral adaptations or central adaptations, sorry. And if we consider the work by Robin Thorpe, we might need to look at individual recovery strategies where we consider different recovery modalities, especially in this tournament format. Do we provide them with heat versus cold, which might stimulate a different response? This is obviously more speculative, but has potential implications further down the line. Thank you for listening. Obviously, I want to thank a couple of colleagues and kind of previous students, current students, as well as Hawkin Dynamics and Dr. Tim Suckman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was awesome. Like I was saying, if you all want to utilize the Q&A channel or the chat channel, if you have any questions for Nick, I know we do have a few minutes here that we can field a few questions. That was great. I mean, I loved how you touched on obviously so many. I feel like hamstring assessments are such a flashy thing now, and so many people I feel like are stuck on one thing. So I thought it was super interesting, all the different, like, let's say like I saw obviously like the Hawkin True Strength, like, hey, there's so many versatile options, like which one do you do? Like but like the answer isn't just one. Like it has to, there's so many more pieces that go into it. I think that's so interesting, especially over social media right here. You hear so many things that are just like, oh, test isometrics or do Nordic hamstrings or do something, but like there's so many more pieces that go into it. So that's super interesting there. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to toss them here again in the Q&A chat here or in the regular chat here. We do have, again, a few minutes here to do some questions. Give it a couple seconds here to pull in. Do you have any research studies that are in progress right now? They're going off of this. Are you doing any research with like lacrosse? Because I know you mentioned that you've recently gotten into that. These are studies in place right now?
Yeah, so we have probably more so in the soccer. So working with my colleague, Dr. Chris Brammer, around the sprint movement assessment score.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at how running mechanics are potentially implicated. So he's recently kind of started to pull together some of the work around prospective and retrospective injury with sprint movement assessment score. So actually running mechanics relates to injury, but we're starting to now integrate some of the force assessment into that as well. That some of the rapid and peak force might have implications onto the movement mechanics when we consider kind of particularly kind of things like backside mechanics, which are a key limb injury. Can we maximize those through hamstring training, which might be following on a little bit further down the line? But yeah, definitely looking around that kind of overall holistic approach of kind of running mechanics, kind of strength, previous injuries. Something I'm more interested in is a little bit more around muscle architecture as well, and then having that wider holistic approach.
Are you guys planning on doing anything with like EMG as well with that, with like muscle?
So one of the students that is kind of one of Chris Brammer's has started to look at EMG during different running based drills, but it's not necessarily associated with what we've done at the minute.
Gotcha. We do have a few questions here. So we have someone that said, Braden said he's currently pre-op for ACL reconstruction. Would it be worth it to get baseline isometric data before surgery? What if I can't get to 90 degrees right now? What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely worth getting baseline data before surgery. I have torn my LCL at the minute, so I'm in the same boat. I'm just trying to I'm waiting on for surgery, but definitely worth getting some baseline data to start to see where you get back to. And again, this is where we get really good usability in the different test assessments. So something like maybe a long lever bridge where you are at more extended position, or a 30-30 isometric assessment. Again, you're at that longer hip position to potentially kind of offset those range of motion demands. So I'd definitely look to get some baseline data for that.
Awesome. We had one from here from Carly. She said, what would be a field test to test hamstrings without fancy technology? Oh, good point.
So obviously we don't all have access to force plate technology or kind of true strength. And I think a really simple assessment of eccentric hamstring strength is a Nordic breakpoint angle. So we all know you get to that point where you go, I'm not holding this anymore, and you just fall, you just collapse. And that can be identified by a simple 2D analysis. There are a couple of apps available that can look to manage that for you, to identify and kind of clarify that angle. So the Nordic breakpoint angle is a really easy field-based assessment without that fancy technology, as you say. So literally just an iPhone or any kind of camera and look at the kind of knee angle at where you can no longer control that descent.
Sports science in your pocket. Nice. We have another one here. They said this may be outside the scope of the presentation, but have you personally seen any specific correlations between early sport specialization and increased hamstring injury risk?
No, it's not anything I've really looked into, to be honest. So I'm not going to comment. I think there's probably more going to come out around that. But when we look at, especially our link to kind of soccer, because that's probably what I'm more familiar with the youth setting, is more and more athletes are going into kind of these settings a lot earlier and specializing a lot earlier. When we think about major academies, kind of Manchester United, La Masia in Barcelona and Real Madrid, they are starting to specialize very early. But the potential risk of injury is still quite low when we think about youth athletes as well. Muscle injuries are pretty limited in terms of their frequency. Probably more related to growth-related injuries, might be more kind of prevalent there, especially when we start going through that growth spurt and that rapid change in maturation.
Awesome. All right, jumping over to the chat here, we have another one who is a strength and conditioning practitioner. They said, how often should the coaches implement the hamstring test assessments throughout a season?
Good question. So it depends what purpose you're going to use the test for. So as you saw, like the work from Spagnolo, they performed, it was a eccentric hamstring assessment. They did that every single week, but they have the usability of the Nord board and the ability to track that and save that regularly. If you're just going to use it to monitor over time, so like the work presented with Oldham Rugby League, where we monitored it pre-season and then we did it once in season, and we'll probably do it once more at the end of the season. So we've done it over 3 time points. So again, the usability of these tests means it's dependent on your purpose. So if you're just looking at training changes and maybe some relevance of injury screening, less frequently. If you want to use the assessment for fatigue monitoring, then it needs to be done almost every week. It needs to be in those kind of periods between games and between training sessions to monitor those changes. Definitely within different sports, it does change. So I was speaking a couple of years ago now to one of the coaches at an NBA team, and the way they did their screening was bi-weekly. So 1 week would be hamstrings, 1 week would be groins. So that was almost every 2 weeks, that kind of screening, but it was for the purpose of fatigue monitoring. So yeah, it completely depends on the purpose you're going to use it for, right, and going from there.
Awesome. So I have a few more here. It said, in your experience, is it worth to use sprints with longer distances rather than ones demanded by the sport as a protective exercise?
You probably got to go a bit back to kind of the specificity of training, thinking if that is what they're going to be exposed to, definitely train them for that. You need to consider the worst case scenario. In some instances, soccer players, especially in sports like rugby league as well and rugby union, players might be expected to run in excess of 100 meters at full tilt. So actually, we probably do need to expose them to some of those characteristics when we consider that speed endurance and making sure we're maintaining those physical characteristics and technical mechanics to mitigate the strain being placed on the hamstrings. And a few years ago, there was a nice clip that I found that identified that when a player, he was a rugby player, he made a break and he was being chased down for a tackle. He actually had to change his running mechanics to mitigate his tackle, or to minimize the chance of him getting tackled, which could have actually exaggerated his risk of injury by going into almost straight leg bounds while he's sprinting to avoid a tap tackle. So there's definitely a benefit to having different sprint modalities and different kind of sprint designs, whether it's length, whether it's from a walking start, whether it's from a back pedal and turn, whether it's from a shuffle and go, and kind of different kind of intensities through the sprint, whether it's a flying sprint or kind of multiple elevations through it.
Yeah, because obviously it depends on the game. Like in real life situations, like you could have any or all of those situations. Yeah. Let's say we'll have one more here. Do you see anything in particular with hamstring strength and repeated lower leg injuries such as strains, ACL, etc.? Correlations between those, which I know you talked about a little bit in your presentation, but
yeah, so we know there's a really good relationship, or kind of a relationship between eccentric hamstring strength and hamstring strain injury risk. There's some association there with ACL injury risk as well. When we think about the key role of the hamstrings during kind of those knee landing tasks, knee flexion tasks, is to prevent that anterior tibial translation. If that's coincided with that knee abduction moment as well, especially we consider the adductor's role within those movements. So there's definitely relationships to hamstring strain injury risk and eccentric hamstring strength. We know with isometric assessments, it's still not as clear cut. Obviously, the work from Driggers identifies some association, but actually it was only marginally better than kind of a top coin toss. So we do need to kind of consider wider metrics and assessments as well, which might also include then eccentric and isometric, as well as then muscle architecture, running mechanics, and running loads. So there's association between the factors, but it's not as clear cut.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I think that was our last question. Thank you so much again, especially hopping on at such a late time. For those who don't know, he is over in the UK, so for like 9 p.m. his time. So huge thank you for you joining us today. But yeah, without that further ado, we'll move on to our next speaker. We'll keep this rolling. So I'm very happy to introduce Brenna McDonald. Brenna McDonald is from the University of Pittsburgh, and she's on the strength and conditioning staff as of February of 2022. She has since been promoted to the senior assistant strength coach to the director of Olympic sports of strength and conditioning. At Pitt, she trains men's and women's soccer teams, as well as oversight over the full S&C staff, fellows, and runs the staff continuing education, social media platforms, and a bunch of other things. Prior to Pitt, Brenna worked at the University of Kentucky for 6 years, where she earned her master's degree and completed internships at the University of Iowa and the University of Wisconsin. And she's also a native of Chicago. So without further ado, I will open it up the stage to Brenna here.
Perfect. Thanks, Kat. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen right now. All right. Everybody see that okay?
Perfect.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to be taking kind of a different tone with this presentation, a little bit more of the applied sports science side of the field. So as Kat mentioned, a large part of my role is not only training the soccer teams, but also overseeing the various levels of staff members that we have here at Pitt. A little bit of background on me, she had just touched on, is, again, I started off my journey at UW Oshkosh, did an internship at Iowa, Kentucky, and then Pitt. Everything I'm going to talk about today, I very much need to give credit to each of those places that I've been at, because none of these are concepts that I kind of learned on my own. These are all things that every stop I went to, I took a lot away from the mentors that I had and how they went about developing me, and pouring into those that were, working under them, which has always been a passion of mine to kind of give on back. A little bit of background. So when I first got here, I took on the volunteer internship program that we had. Very much kind of built it up from scratch. Took a lot of, again, the experiences that I had in the past, and credit to the staff at Kentucky, because I learned a lot from them of how to run an internship program. I oversaw that for 2.5 years, I believe, until I started to shift into year 2 and 3, when I started to get some sports science master students assigned with me and my teams as well. They've always had a director of sports science, which has been their kind of primary oversight and handles more of their development in the hard skills, as we'll talk about. But especially with kind of the soft skills, I think everything that goes with being paired with a team, that was kind of that next level of mentorship that I took on while at Pitt. And then year 4, really this summer's been the most recent transition, but I'm now overseeing our strength and conditioning fellows, our full-time staff, sports science fellow, as I kind of co-oversee them with our director of sports science, and then some master students as well. I think at Pitt, we have a lot of opportunities to oversee many students. We have a lot of boots on the ground and a lot of helpers, which is a tremendous resource for us. And I think these are people that are taking their time to really pour into our program while they get their education. So the biggest thing that I've learned is making sure that we take the time to kind of pay them back for all of the work that they're doing for us. I think not only it makes it a beneficial experience for those master students and interns coming in, that they leave and we're pushing out better practitioners into the world, but I think it also it's important to build your tree, and it's important to pour back in and have that kind of symbiotic relationship. This quote kind of speaks to itself. Again, I think when I was coming up in the field, it was very much like, oh, I want to learn everything I can about every area of training. And now I'm at the point in time when I think the passion in this really relies around helping those younger coaches and younger strength or sports science professionals find their own way, and really get to help develop those younger coaches. I think is kind of my gauge of success right now, that very much is enjoyable as you get to see these young practitioners go out into the field and do everything that they learned under their time with you. So I'm going to take this presentation in kind of twofold. The first portion is we're going to talk about sports science students. Again, full transparency, we have a director of sports science. He's awesome. We have a sports science master's program. So much of what I speak today about is not going to be, coding in R. That is not my specialty, nor do I ever want it to be. I think this is more of the skills that are going to go around, the skills that we don't often learn in class, of working with various sports teams, other professionals, and even support staff members around you. Because the more I think you get into this field, you learn that it is very much a customer service business. You can make the best coded graph presentation in the world, and if you can't deliver it appropriately, you won't be as effective as either a sports science practitioner or even a strength coach. So a lot of that's kind of what we're going to dive into right now with those students. Stages I kind of outlined, and we'll go in through these each individually, is first off, just kind of settling in, having them learn the hard skills. Once they get through a couple weeks, months, it kind of really depends on the sport that you're working with. In my role with the soccer teams, usually our students join us in the late summer, and they're getting thrown into season real quick. So there's not a lot of time to get to, establish systems and build the trust. You very much get here on campus. You have to be ready to roll with all the technology that we use, and you kind of just learn by getting thrown into the fire. Where in the spring we have a little bit more opportunity that I can start to throw those students into some other opportunities where it's not such a hot topic time for the teams in their competitive season. So they come on, they get in, they see what we have systems in place. They're learning the people, they're learning the routines that we have. After that, we'll kind of get into a couple more conversations, and followed by kind of just setting them up into some opportunities to learn, which we'll get into. All right, the hard skills. So again, this is a little bit more under the house of the sports science staff that we have, but we really make sure that we kind of do a few days of getting to know every resource that we have here at Pitt. We do have Hawkin force plates, we have several other testing technologies, and then we are also blessed with Catapult as well. So depending on the sport assignment that our students get, there's a lot of stuff to get your hands on and get familiar with working with. So they go through testing protocols, just kind of testing administration and data collection. A big part of this early stage is kind of what do we test and why. I think especially coming to Pitt, we're kind of known as a place that has a lot of resources, which we're very, very fortunate to have. But I think people just want to come and learn and get their hands on the tech, and it's more so, okay, great, what are we going to do with that tech? What are the conversations we're going to have around it? And not only that, but, is there even a point to testing this? Like, are you trying to answer a question when you're implementing that test? Data visualization and basic coding for reporting. Again, this will happen more so in their master's programs and in their work with our director of sports science. And then again, kind of those teams that work with Catapult or on-field loading, they need to start to get an understanding of kind of how those loads are tracked, the external load out there, and what conversations, what even metrics we're looking at before they start having those conversations. So once they get in, they get their hands on all that tech. They've seen a couple, they've pulled a report, they've jumped people on the force plates, they're doing what we need them to do. This is when I kind of view it as those next level conversations and discussions. I think depending on the assignment that each student has, it's really important to get them just around conversations that you're having with your sports staff, your assistant, anybody around you that's going to be having those conversations. So if I go out to the soccer field and I go up to one of my coaches, I'm bringing my master student with me. They might not be speaking yet at this time and having input on the decision we make, but I think a big part of these practical experiences is having them hear the verbiage that you are delivering to those coaches. One of the things I think some programs can be missing is that, again, you go learn the hard skills, you learn how to make these reports, you learn what acute to chronic ratio is, but then when you get out there, you don't know how to tell the coach that. And if you deliver it in the wrong way, you can turn a coach off real quickly. So I think just getting them around those conversations, hearing how you approach it. In an ideal world, if you have different sports staffs, they can be near too. You can hear how you communicate with different sports staffs because not all of them, take in information in the same way. So I bring them out there. I try to also start to explain to them, hey, I'm going to tell the coach that I think, we're approaching a high level load for today. Here's why, or here's how I'm viewing this week. And I think that that's really kind of the standout key in a good mentor. That's not just having them kind of collect the iPad on the side. It's more so let's start to kind of get you thinking about what I'm seeing when I look at this. Because it's very easy in these positions to just hold the iPad or put it down and then send the report and never get thinking and having those wheels turning about what that actually means and how that might pair up to that team's weekly training model. Assigning specific tasks with clear outcomes. So I think I start gradual. Sometimes this can be a conversation with your other support staff. So maybe my athletic trainer comes up to me and, we're concerned with someone's performance. So I'll task that student, can you go pull some of this data and see what you're seeing and send it to us. Quick things like that, they start to kind of get familiar with quickly turning over reports and getting it our way. Sometimes it is, hey, can you find a way to, get a graph together so that we can show the coaches what we've done in the past couple weeks. But I think just very clear entry level tasks that it's, you're starting to gain these skills. You've been around the block for a little bit, so you know kind of how we flow here as a team or as an organization at Pitt. And then they get to go come back and be set up for success with the kind of the skills that they're gaining gradually. I like this a lot better than just here's a team, go do it, because you're very much setting up students for failure there if you're not kind of guiding them and again letting them learn these steps as they observe you working in real time. I think a big thing that is usually helpful as you have time kind of on the sideline. And again, my position is very much set up for success with this because I'm able to stand at practices with my master students. Or even our sports science fellow, we get to be out on the field and we can talk about what we're seeing in real time while that practice is going on. Kind of in that next phase, it's talking to them. Hey, you see that we're here at practice. What would you do? What would you say to coach? You might not be having them front facing the coach with that message yet, but you're getting them starting to think and have their own wheels turning on how they might respond, if they were thrown into the fire with talking with that coach. I think this situation too, it kind of leads them, again, you're building up their confidence for the day you do put them in front of a sport coach, but it's a chance for kind of some real life feedback. Hey, I love how you said this. Let's maybe not tell coach what to do. Let's just give them the data and let them make a decision. And I think shifting the verbiage and helping them kind of fine tune those soft skills is a really helpful period of time where they get to kind of start thinking again in your shoes before they're just the person thrown out there making decisions. The real life situations continue. So usually for me, this kind of happens midway through the fall. And it kind of is shifted every year with the students that I get. But as soon as I can, I'm going to have them come start observing our performance team meetings. Performance team meetings is something we do here where it is me, my head coaches, nutritionist, athletic trainer, all sitting at the same table, usually once a week, where we discuss the team. What are we seeing overall? What are we seeing with individual players? What's the coach's practice plan for the week? What's my plan in the weight room or in conditioning? And just kind of getting everybody on the same page. I think this is important for the students to come along and hear, just for a variety of reasons. They're getting professional and real life, examples of how people interact with each other. Sometimes it can be a tense situation that they're observing, which is good. You sit in class and you don't often get to understand how to respond when a sport coach is tense, or kind of challenging a certain area. You get to hear how people handle differing opinions, because a good team is going to have some discussions and maybe challenge each other to view things in a different point of view. So they get to hear a lot of these conversations that, again, you don't just get to learn when you're going through those hard skills. On top of that, they kind of see models of how different schools and universities do their performance team meetings, because everybody does a little bit differently. One of my programs just kind of meets organically each day, and one of them has a formal weekly meeting. So I think exposing students to that and the various ways that teams work, because I think a big thing I preach is that not every coaching staff is going to receive information the same way. And they're not going to want to communicate the same way. I have one coach that likes hard facts and figures, and if you give him a graph or a research article, he's happy. And I have another coach that has told us he wants emojis, and a thumbs up, thumbs down, so he can keep on cruising with his busy day. And I think it's important that these students are kind of get exposed to both types of coaching staffs, so that they understand how to bring the knowledge that they have and make it in a digestible format for that coach in order to be effective. I think there's a lot of things too with the athlete feedback and navigating tough questions. Sometimes this is an athlete coming up and being, asking a question about their load or their workouts or something they're concerned about their performance. Sometimes it's something kind of on the back end, maybe a more serious matter that you are, monitoring as performance staff with the athletes that you work with. And those are really, really key experiences for anybody that's helping with you to get to be around to hear how to navigate. I think the first time I've had an athlete that you're monitoring for certain situations was when I was full-time, so getting to see how others handle that before you get thrown into the fire is, invaluable. And I also think just kind of the athlete front-facing feedback is a really key part of what we do well here with our students, because athletes, we're in a day and age where they want to know. They're going to come up and ask what their loads are. They're going to ask why their jump height wasn't as high. And starting to find a way that it's not just the textbook answer, it's an approachable answer to kind of bring the athlete, some trust in you as the practitioner, but also kind of give them that, layman's terms of where they're at and why they're seeing these numbers and what those mean. So I think that's a really key experience for these students to be around and hear. And once they hear you do it a couple times, they start to gain those skills that they themselves can then answer the student athletes, or be prepared to go do it in real life once they enter that next position. I think the other thing is be transparent about failures. The world of athletics and any team and model you're in is not going to go perfectly. There will be things that you did great. There'll be things that you didn't do great. There's times you communicate really well. There's other times where you look back and you're like, man, I could have communicated this differently. So I always really make it a point with anybody that's working under me to bring some of those up. I think that it's important if someone under me can learn from something that I did wrong and it saves them from making that same mistake down the road. Why not share it with them so that they can, be better prepared for this? I think too, when I was, first in this, I always thought that, everything would go perfectly. And I was like, if I'm organized enough and if I have everything going right, there won't be any hiccups along the road. So I'd beat myself up when those hiccups did pop up. But as I mentioned before, this is customer service. Training is customer service to athletes. Sports science is customer service to coaches or any support staff members you're working with. And there's going to be days where it's not, a perfect conversation where people aren't happy with what you're saying. And I think it's just learning to navigate that and not making the same mistakes twice, learning from those and adapting moving forward and tweaking your process. That's a really key thing to share with your young people, so that they can learn from things that you've been through. I think the next stage of this is letting them lead. So you've had these conversations again on the side, you've kind of hypothetically walked through what they might say or what they might do. And now it's time to set them up for success with some of those conversations they've had. Most often for me, this is usually like once the season's died down and we're in the spring for soccer, where we're able to, there's still games, there's still competition, we're looking at loading, but it's not such high stakes with, multiple games a week and quick turnover. I have had times where this has happened a little bit earlier in the fall. It just kind of depends on the relationship of your sports science student or practitioner or fellow, and what your team is weathering through at that time. But I think it's really important to give ownership to them and again, set them up for success. Some things I'll do with this is having them lead a team talk. So on that bottom left corner of the slide, you'll see a small excerpt of infographic that I had some of my master students make. And each year I'll have them kind of talk through with the team, because I think athletes nowadays come on in and they get tested on a lot of stuff, and we never really do a great job of telling them what they're getting tested on. So one great win that for master students to get used to kind of presenting a easy infographic, which is something they'll do in their career, and then also speak in front of a group and have to show off the knowledge that they're learning, is, hey, make an infographic on high speed distance, make an infographic on the force plates. Let's talk about it, and go tell the team you have 5 minutes, here's what you got, and get them used to kind of speaking in front of those groups, because they have to gain that confidence if they ever want to be a director of sports science speaking in front of a room of sport coaches. So I'll have them lead those talks, and then we'll talk about it after. Great job. Love the presentation. You could have been a little louder, or hey, let's, dumb this down a little bit for these athletes. Let's find a more relatable way for them to go about it. I think a lot of times it's just, you have the hard fact that you learned about the metric, and that's great. But to the student athlete, they just want to hear, more isn't better, and finding a way to relate to the athletes from where they're at, even though they're interested in it, they just don't have the same knowledge base that you have. It's a really great chance for feedback for your young people so that they understand how to bring that knowledge to anyone they're working with. I've had them in those performance meetings. So once they've kind of observed some, my current math student I'll have her make a weekly image of what we've done with our catapult loads, and then we head into that practice, and she gets some time to talk and present it to the coaches. I'm there to fill in anything if she gets stuck on anything, but for the most part, we've prepped her up to this point, we've built her up, and now I trust her to go in there and kind of speak her message and deliver that to the coaching staff. And I think the coaching staff's been great and receptive at kind of receiving her message and asking her questions as she goes. But it's a great kind of next step, because again, no one really teaches you in school how exactly to deliver these messages to the coaches. And it can be pretty scary at first, depending on the coaching staff you work with, because you don't want to be the one that says the wrong thing or puts out a message where coaches think that you're telling them what to do. So those are really good steps of starting to expose them to some more decision making, which I think is the last point. So now again, spring ball, it's less high stakes, and we have a little bit more opportunity, more room for training with fewer games throughout the week. So now as they're standing there at practice and they're monitoring with the iPad, it's, hey, I want you to go tell coach that we're a little bit high. Tell me what you'd say. Sounds great. Get out there, go talk to them. And throwing them into the fire a little bit more of being the voice that's out there, helping make recommendations, helping educate the coaches on where they're at, so that they are prepared when they, head to that next spot. Last part of this, I think, is professional skills. Again, I think it's equally as important. The hard skills that you learn are the soft skills of delivering your message. I've seen some really smart practitioners that are really ineffective in how they communicate data to coaches and recommendations. And I've seen some that do a great job of it. So I think the ones that do a great job of the communicating are above and beyond more effective, just because they come off as a relatable person that's not in there to change the coach's whole philosophy on practices. They're just there to aid and help make their program better. We're really big on having data drive conversations here, not decisions. So with any of the tech that we have, as we talk to our staff members, it's very much, hey, here's what we're seeing. What questions do you have? Here are the possible routes you could go. It's never, hey, coach, you have to stop practice because this is pretty high, or hey, coach, all the force plate jumps are down. You have to, give them a day off. We never approach it from that method. It's always more of just, here's kind of the picture that we're seeing. What do we as a group think that is the best step moving forward? I think it's really important that students are able to go learn a confident and clear recommendation when asked. It can be scary the first time that you go from learning everything you're learning in your program to then going and being the one to make a recommendation. Because as most people know, there's no one right way to go about anything in this field, which is both a beautiful and terrifying thing, because you never truly know, if you're doing the right thing. And when you're new to this, that's intimidating as hell to try to push out that information. So getting not only a confident voice when you speak in front of people on interviews, to sport coaches, on a panel, anything like that. But I also think a clear message. The biggest thing I see our students struggle with sometimes is when they do get the chance to go push out that information, it's like, oh, you could do this, or or you couldn't, up to you, and the way they say it gets pretty muddy. But sport coaches want someone that's going to be able to give them that confident message and not have someone that's going back and forth on the same sentence and you don't really know where they're coming from. So that confidence and clarity is really important. Interview skills. The more and more positions I interview people for, I think not enough people are actually taking their young people through interview skills. I'm not just talking, how to answer a question about your philosophy or whatever you might be asked. I think it's the presentation of an interview, how you dress, how you prepare, how you research the staff. But then also the confidence in answering the skills that you're learning in your practical settings. Too many, young people are coming in and don't show off what they've learned and what they've gained in those positions. And I truly think that that's something a good mentor should take some time and work on their people under them with, because there's not often times in classes that you're going to learn that in an academic sense. So it's very much something that I think is our duty to help push out those young people and prepare them so that when opportunities come up, they're able to thrive and show off what they've learned when they've been under you in your mentorship. And then I think the last thing is portfolio preparation. Throughout the last year that I've had a couple of my master's students and fellows right now, they've cranked out a ton of reports for me. And every time I tell them, like, hey, this might be a big project that's going to be a pain for you, but this is going to pay off when you have several examples in your portfolio that you can go bring to your next job, showing off the many variety of situations that you've learned and seen and worked in this year. So I think, again, it's not just, hey, give me this report, go on, good work. It's more about, let's talk about it. Let's say, what are good things to put in there? What are things that we can have you, start to add so that you have a well-rounded portfolio, knowing what kind of population that you want to work with as you head into the field. All of those, again, we have the master's program that they go through. We have our head of sports science who works with all of these students. This is just kind of from a team-based assignment that is how I think it's important to go about giving those extra sets of skills to these students alongside just the practical, hey, you went and pulled my cattle report, or hey, you sent me a jump report, alongside those teams. The second half of this presentation is a little bit more of the strength and conditioning side of things, a little bit more of the wheelhouse I came to Pitt and began with, but it's the flip side. So, that's what we try to do for those sports science practitioners that know they don't want to coach. They know they'd like to be more on the data side of things. I think the other thing is there's many positions where you're going to do a little bit of both. You're going to do some sports science and some strength conditioning. So now we're going to talk about kind of how to develop those younger coaches and what I've had success with and what I've kind of learned with as we've gone. So outline for this, intern orientation we'll talk through the curriculum. Usually in this portion of things, I'll kind of talk about how we prepare the strength coaches with sports science, but we'll kind of meld those two since we just went through our sports scientists. And then again, talking about full-time positions towards the end. This is something I credit the staff of Kentucky for that I learned. So when anybody that's coaching with us, and again, we have some hybrid students, get to our campus, I'm going to take them through an orientation. I think that we live in a world where you may have experiences before you arrive on a campus, and you could have a totally different set of expectations than what your current staff or what we have here at Pitt. And I think sometimes too, you get out of classes, you learn, everything in the textbook, and then you get into the real world. And there's never been a time where it's like, let's actually go through these hands-on clear standards of what we're looking for. So when I had the internship, even when, some of our fellows that come on in, we take them through just kind of the basics, to be honest. And it sounds like it's, pretty bland and boring. And a lot of times I go into it and I'm like, hey, for some of you, this might be pretty remedial. But even our more experienced fellows and interns end up coming away with and being like, I've never actually walked through this with people. So we take time, we go through the main strength movements, we go through Olympic lifting, whether you choose to use it or not. I always say I don't care. I know everyone's got a different, philosophy on that, but I think that a lot of these positions are about building your tool belt. I'm going to give you the tools to fill your tool belt, and you can choose to select whatever tool you want when you go to do, whatever training you want to do. But I at least think it's important that you know how to use each tool well. So we don't only go through like what the movements are, but we go through what are common flaws. What happens when the bar bars coming away from you on a clean. What happens? This kid's always catching with their elbows down, and you keep yelling, "Get your elbows up!" But something's going wrong before they caught that weight. That if you take the time to teach them every component of it, they're going to understand how to actually fix the first pull or keep their toes down so that their elbows they are catching it in a good position. But we take these days, I've had it anywhere from 3 to 5 days we've gone through it. It's just getting them out there. Let's talk about it and then let's go do it. Let's watch each other. Let's see how we coach each other and cue each other and correct each other. Going through spotting and safety protocols. Not everybody is taught that before they get into some of these positions. I've had people with multiple internships that get into a paid position and not know how to spot correctly. So to me, it's just, I think I'm big on consistency and clarity, not only with my teams, but also with any staff members that are under me. And I think it's really, really important to lay out those clear standards. This is what I think is a good job. This is what I'm going for. This is what I think we as a staff would all agree upon is kind of where we'd like you to be coaching and set them up for success. If you don't go through something like this, it's a lost opportunity to have success, since they don't know what standards you might be looking for. I think this cleans up a lot of things for, just kind of the technical components of what you're asking for as a coach on the floor. But it also is a chance to kind of experience a ground zero as well. So if you have any of your helpers, teaching orientation group or a group of ground zero athletes, you can set this up in a way where you're not only going through common cues and coaching things that you need to fix, but it's also, hey, run it like a ground zero. And now you're teaching your young people how to go run an introductory program to the weight room as well. So when done right, you can really knock a couple birds out with one stone, of just kind of preparing them for success, because one day they'll go on their own and have to teach their own interns, or they'll have to teach, their own ground zero group. And you were the one that kind of exposed them to that as how to do it. For the internship curriculum, I mentioned that we are building the coach's tool belt. I think that includes several things. So there's on the floor coaching, there is programming that we need to do. There's various whiteboard discussions we'll go through. Today's whole talk is kind of about leadership. There will be a time that anyone that works under you is going to be a leader in some capacity. Maybe they're leading a staff, maybe they're leading an internship, or maybe they're leading a team. Either way, again, I think it's not always something that we're taught naturally in the classes that we have. It's more, here's bio, here's chem, all right, can you program, take your CS, and now you're out into the world. And working with people, again, I'll keep saying it's a customer service job. I think it's entirely important that you go through and develop those skills. Professional development, we kind of touched on in sports science. We'll touch on it again. And then again, just making sure your strength and conditioning practitioners know about the technology, how to use it, what they might be looking for to test, and setting them up so that if they have a sports science staff, they know how to communicate with them. And if they don't, they know how to use these tools for their own, benefit on their own, and use that to test and monitor their own teams. On the floor coaching. So this is something that we've done for a couple of years here. And to this day, I think is one of the best parts of teaching young people that I've ever done, because again, it's not something that most people go through and take the time to kind of correct and give feedback with young coaches. So for these, call them coach teach drills. They start simple to complex. It might be, an intern and they have 2 athletes, fake athletes, I'll say. It's usually me and a couple staff members that have some free time. But they're going to go out there as their fake athletes, and then that intern gets to run the team of those 2 coaches as if they're their full-time team. Sounds silly at first, but it is invaluable for teaching coaching angles, coaching floor presence, evaluating how they're cueing things, and even just how they speak to the student athletes. You can get so much stuff out of these drills, and the interns get a lot of feedback, where you don't always get to get that feedback when you have a team of 30 out on the weight room floor and everybody's just trying to keep all the moving parts going. So usually they start off, there's maybe 1 Olympic movement, 1 strength movement. Again, I'm not pushing the Olympic lifts all hard. It's just throughout this time, I think it's important that they at least learn how to coach them should they choose to use them. They'll do 2 sets of something. We do 1 thing wrong. If they correct it, then you move on to the next. If they don't, you keep on riding it out. And then when the exercise is done, we bring them up and we give them feedback right away. Here's what you did well. Here's what you can improve on for the next time. The next round, a couple weeks later, it depends on the term of the internship that we have, we'll beef it up a little bit more. Maybe we will add a little bit more of the chaotic, okay, you're the athlete that's not paying attention, you're the athlete that wants to go fast. Whatever it is, we'll add some curveballs. And usually by the third or fourth one that we're doing, we add a little bit more chaos to it, where there's a circuit and they need to, watch more parts of the weight room than just 2 racks. Again, I usually have them stand behind a line. I think you can see in some of the pictures there, it's got some bands on the ground, but I want these interns to be able to learn how to coach from far away and use their voice and project. And I want them to figure out how to be effective with the cueing that they have, because you might not always have a lot of time to have a full conversation like a lot of our interns come in wanting to have. Sometimes it just needs to be, hey, keep the bar close, and then you move on and coach the next thing. So we usually do anywhere from like 3 to 5 of these with our interns as they come on into the program. And again, it's invaluable because I think this is really where you see the most growth out of our students, master students, interns, whoever's going through it, as they learn how to fill their own space on the floor and how they learn to effectively manage the floor and the workout that they have in front of them. This is a great opportunity for you too, as someone, like I talked in the sports science component of setting them up for small wins and successes. If I've seen that an intern can do this well in their coaching drill, then I'm more likely to let's say, hey, intern, you can talk to the soccer team today and tell them about their lift. I know that I'm not throwing them into the fire and they're going to fail in front of a group and have it be a whole event, because I've seen them do it in front of the coaching staff, and I know that they're prepared to do a great job talking to the team and talking in front of the team. So it's very much kind of that preparatory step before you throw them a couple bones in real life, where they get to do things with the actual team, and then they get to see all that hard work that paid off through these coaching drills moving forward. Programming project. Again, a lot of times you sit in school and you might have a programming class if you're in a kinesiology type, program. And I remember learning it, and I had great professors. This is no diss to the education system. It's just you're drinking from a fire hose when you learn about this. And then you go into the real world and you're like, I have no idea how to program or what this percentage meant. So we take them through a programming project through various stages. And it's just a helpful chance. Again, I'm big on feedback. I think you've seen every example today is exercise and then feedback behind it. But this allows our young people to start writing a program step by step, and then meeting with someone who's done it. And again, can give them advice on things that we've learned, mistakes we've made, and help guide them towards a program that might be more effective for them. So usually we'll go through a needs analysis. They get assigned a team at random. I don't like giving everyone the same team because they'll very quickly all have the same program. So everybody gets a different team. And then I typically pair them up with various members of our staff. So our baseball guy is going to oversee the baseball program, our softball guy, the softball program, and they get to go learn different sports. So they're doing their own work, but then they also get to build a relationship with more people on the staff than just your internship supervisor, which is invaluable in itself too, because when they go to leave, I want them to know the whole staff. I want them to be memorable by the whole staff, not just that person that directly oversaw them. So they'll research their sport, and then they'll come on back and report that, talk through it with their point person, we call it, before they can move on to that next phase of the program. After that, we have them go exercise selection. We have them just write all exercise selection. Usually it's an off-season program if it's a pretty novice intern group. If you have a more advanced group or master students, you can always go a different direction with this. But you're going to write all of your exercise selection for 12 weeks if you're a beginner, and then we'll talk through the progressions and where you were heading with those exercises. Once they do that, you can work on volume and intensity for some main and power movements. Then you can go accessories. And then most of the time we'll have them do an actual program defense where they talk in front of the staff. This is important because it's not only, you're defending your own work, which again is scary in a world where there's no one right way to do anything. But I also think it teaches you how to speak in front of that group, which you need to do if you're in front of teams or coaching staffs or any of the sort. And it gets you having solid reasoning why you do things. We often see the first time they do this, they're like, I think the kids are ready for that. And instead of saying, hey, based on these measurements or based on this progression I did, they are prepared. So I think it grows the skills that they will need in interviews in real life, of them answering why they programmed something and, what it's going to do for that team, so that when they do talk to coaches or athletes or anything like that, they're more in the habit, they have trained the muscle of answering in an educated manner why they did what they did for that team. Whiteboard discussions. This is kind of the catch-all for some of the things that didn't fit my main categories. This is also a chance that I get to have other members of our staff speak to our young people, so that A, they're not only learning from me, because I think we all have different philosophies and ways to go about things on our staff, but B, we get to have people that specialize in different things go put out their specialty to our interns. I think on top of it too, now that I'm in the role of overseeing some full-times as well, it's important to keep your full-time staff getting to present things and their knowledge as well. Because sometimes you go a bit of time without having to present, and then when they are called to present one day, now they're used to doing that and having presentations whipped up. So you can really do this in a way that is beneficial for your whole staff and everyone involved, because everybody's getting an experience as they go, and have these discussions. But we'll go through speed and agility. We'll go through energy system development and conditioning, return to play, kind of at a superficial level for this, but just kind of introduction to return to play in those conversations. We'll talk about load monitoring and prescription. And then we'll do a lot of professional talks. As I mentioned, it is kind of shocking how many experiences you'll get as an interviewer of people that are not prepared to do that. So I think that's something that we really pride ourselves on, is trying to make our young people go put on and represent us well when they go out and to interview for different positions, not only for our own, tree of network, but so that they are set up to success to be considered and in contention for those jobs. And then one of my favorite things is always the staff roundtable. Again, usually you have one person in charge of that group of students that you're hearing a lot of their thoughts and their philosophy, but having a roundtable where your whole staff can sit up front in a just kind of open environment and let the interns talk. Typically, I'll kind of pick 3 or 4 topics for that roundtable, and then anyone can ask questions and any full-time staff can answer. And sometimes you hear how we each tackle problems in a different way, which I think is really valuable too, because again, there's no one way to do these things. So these have always led to some really great discussions, and then sometimes open my eyes too of other conversations we can have to prepare these young practitioners if it's something that maybe we didn't have in our curriculum before. Leadership talks. So as I mentioned before, in some capacity, everyone's going to be a leader at any level, as they go into really any job, but also especially in athletics. So I think the leadership talks are one of my favorites because it's kind of the passion of mine. But I treat these as kind of open, small group discussions. A lot of times I'll send off a reading. I'll give them a couple weeks to knock out a chunk of that reading, and then we'll come back and sit down as a group and have some discussions. I usually try to have this be intern-led, and I always say the less I talk in these, the better for them, because I want to hear them bring their own ideas to each other and challenge each other and see what everyone else got out of these readings. I think it's less impactful if I just sit up there and say, do this, do that, do this, and it's more impactful if they each get to kind of, see the different ways they viewed it, the reading that they had, and then also kind of talk about their own experiences, and they get closer as a group as well. So the first chapter of this and segment of it is usually how to lead yourself. I think that it's really hard to lead a group if you don't know how to lead yourself. And I always think that's really important. If I am late to my session with my interns, why are they going to respect me? And then also, why are they going to come on time to our talk? Because I'm not, walking the walk or talking the talk. I'm not just talking the talk as I go. So I think with teams, with interns, with anybody around you, with your staff, you need to know how to carry yourself, and you need to know how to conduct your business so that you're gaining the respect from those people under you. You're not that person that we've all had in some level of a boss or something where, you're constantly frustrated with kind of how they're handling themselves, and maybe they're going back and forth in different directions, and it's frustrating to follow. So Chop Wood Carry Water is always a great read that I have. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's like a 4th grade reading level, but it has lessons that will stay with you, throughout your career. And I not only push it to our young people, but I've also, sent excerpts of it to my teams in times that I think that it would have been applicable to them. So we go through little discussions with that. We'll also talk about how to lead others. Again, harder to do if you can't lead yourself. So we kind of build these off of each other. And we'll talk about what's your why. I think it's important that you have your own values and your own kind of decision tree of who you want to be as a leader, because there are times in this field where it's not going to always be a clear-cut situation on how to handle it. So I think having some of these discussions of what you want to be as a coach, what you want to be as a leader, and why you're doing it is really important, because it gives you kind of a reference point to come back to when you have to make these tough decisions. So a lot of these will be, again, situational. Hey, an athlete comes in and is late, I have to treat them the exact same way I treat any athlete. I can't have, one person getting kicked out and one person I'm letting slide off the hook. That makes me an inconsistent leader. It's reading from some of these great people that know far more than I do, but then it's also relating it back to situations that could pop up as a strength and conditioning coach that your varying levels of leadership is important to know and hold true. And maybe they're experiences that they haven't thought about yet, but you get to discuss it before they're thrown into some of these positions where you are in charge of a team and you need to, kind of be thinking of how you are presenting as a leader and the consistency and stability that you bring to those that you're leading. And then the last thing here, there's a couple things we learned kind of from the military and some of the leadership classes I've been fortunate enough to take, but just kind of having a visioneering sheet of a direction that they want to go in life. And it's not just as a practitioner, because I think sometimes in this field, it's very easy to be just Brenna, the strength coach, and have no idea who I am outside of the job. And I see a lot of young coaches struggle with that. So trying to figure out who they are as a well-rounded person so that they can bring their best self to the job is really important. Professional development. I alluded to this with the sports science component of this, but here's kind of a little bit of how we dive into that for our young people. First things first, you usually get only a couple weeks into the semester if it is just a semester-based program and they're already applying to the next steps. So once we kind of got the orientation in, the foundation of everything, I have them send me their cover letter and their resume and references, and then I go through it with them. I mark it up, I have them make changes. We'll have them even start to make some mock cover letters for the next step that they might be ready for, if that's a GA or a full-time or something else, so that they have all of their stuff updated and ready to go for when jobs do pop up. I give them feedback, and then I know once jobs pop up, okay, their resume is pretty put together, like I can trust that that's good to go. They're going to be all right sending that off into the world. I send them practice interview questions. This kind of depends on the people that are under you. I've had some groups that answer things all right, and I can just give them some stuff to practice. I've had some groups that have struggled with this, and maybe we practice a little bit more one-on-one, knowing that that's their Achilles heel. But I think exposing them to some things that they might get asked, not so that they memorize it, but more so that they start practicing and again thinking in the shoes of answering about who they are and what they might do in those roles. Interview etiquette's big, sending the thank yous, how you communicate, researching the staff that you look at. These are all things you have to tell your young people because you might have learned it as you're coming up through it, but no one is telling them that in their classes. So it's the job of the practicum experience to make sure that you are educating them on how to go about this interview process. And I think the last thing is a networking assignment, not only telling them to go contact other professionals in the field. I've hired several people just because they called me at one point to hear about my experience as a professional, and they had a great conversation. And then the next thing you know, we have an opening and I know their name because we just talked, so they get put to the front of the pile. I've had other people, I had a guy who wanted to go into soccer, one of my fellows. Told him to call some people in soccer and hear about their journey. And the guy he called ended up saying he was leaving his job. And he's like, do you want my job? And my fellow got a job right with there. So I not only tell them to go call people, but also prepare them to have professional conversation. Here's how you write a professional email or message off to then go get people to answer and set up those calls with you. Collaborative projects. So this is where we kind of bridge the two. We have our sports science students, we have our strength and conditioning students. Sometimes you have people that want to do both and they're kind of learning a little bit of both curriculums. But what you didn't get out of either of those is how to work with each other. There might be a time that my sports scientist wants to do blank and I want to do blank, and we have to come to terms of what's best for this team. So I think we try really much to get them interacting with each other, educating each other, making sure that they each are speaking the same language, but then also setting them up in some environments where they have to learn how to work with each other. So sports science interns, strength and conditioning interns might have a project. You guys lay out a testing battery and talk about why and figure out how this is going to influence your programming. And it's been really beneficial too for them to go again, learn those collaborative skills and get a taste of what real life might be like, when they have all of this tech at their disposal and how they're going to work with each other to use it. This is more so for our fellows positions, but just preparing people for full-time positions. Every year I have students that are, getting ready to enter the world and they have no idea how to do so. So I really sit down with each of them and ask, we kind of get a feel for what their next step might be. Maybe that's a full-time job. Maybe they're going to go tactical. Maybe they want, they should go sports science instead of coaching. But I think getting a feel for what the right next step is for each person under you is important. I always tell them what buckets do they need to be filled. So we sit down and do some goals when they first get there. And I always tell them what scares you the most about the next full-time job. Make that list, write it down, and then let's start to tackle it and chip away at it. We go through mock interviews, so I've set things up with our other support staff on campus so that they go talk to an athletic trainer, they go talk to a sport coach. It gives your sport coach experience interviewing if they're an assistant and they want to be a head coach one day, but then it also gives your students experience going to speak with those people and putting on professional clothing and getting asked questions from various disciplines, because we're all going to ask different things. I have them research jobs and I show them how to research those jobs so that they're not the person on the interview asking, where that staff's been before. They know where these staff members have been. We go through questions to ask, asking the questions at the end of the interview, what to ask about that position, I think is not something that everybody's taught either. So, hey, go, lay out 5 questions I want you to ask at the end of the interview, and let's talk about it before you go on this interview so that we make sure you're coming off appropriate, but also you're getting a feel for the position you're applying for. And then I think the last thing is benefits. Everybody's like, hey, do you get benefits with this job? But no one ever actually talks to their young people like, what are good benefits? What are things you should look for? So having those conversations and so that they know how to navigate when they are offered what they're looking at and what they're set up for too, I think is also important. Very last thing, and I know I'm going a couple minutes over, but just keeping your first full-time job. I think having a plan for your young people once they get there, this is a big thing I have them put in their portfolios and their interview prep, but knowing what they're going to do if they get that job for the first 30, 60, 90 days, how they're going to conduct themselves, because usually you leave a GA or a fellowship and you're feeling like you're at the top of the world, you know how to do everything. And then you go into that next place and you just tell everybody what you know, you don't listen to those staffs. And so you're set up, not for success, because now everyone's like, well, this person wants to come in and change everything about our program. They don't actually want to come in and listen to what we have and have, make an impact on what we're already doing. They just want to come in and put their system in. So I think it's really important that you prepare people for that, that they have to come in and listen more than they talk, that they have to come in and earn their job. Just because you got it doesn't mean you get to be complacent. And I think that they have to be prepared to have some hard conversations, be it after action reviews, talking with various staff members and seeing how you can get better. But you should be the driver, especially if you're coming out of our program, you should go somewhere and be the driver that's going to add more to the team than you expect in return. And I think those are really key conversations to have with anybody under you before you send them off into the world, so that they, do a great job when they get out there and they're very prepared for anything that comes their way. That is what I got for you guys on that. My email is on there. If you have any questions on there, if you're someone entering the field and you want to talk about how to get in the field, anything like that, I'm happy to hop on a call with you and talk a little bit more about what we do here, or just even kind of giving you advice for other positions. So thank you very much to Hawkin. Thanks to Kat for setting this up, and thanks to everyone for listening to what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Brenna. That was awesome. I mean, so many things we've said I feel like hit home, especially the piece you talked about, it's basically customer service. Like, there's so many soft skills that apply. So I actually come from a strength and conditioning background, actually, and now I'm in customer success. So it's actually kind of funny, but I feel like there's so many skills that I learned as a strength coach that now apply to, obviously I'm still in the sports science field, but so many skills I learned within strength and conditioning, like how to speak to a coach, how to speak to, is it a coach that wants a graph, like you said, a smiley face, is it someone that wants to dig into data, is it someone that doesn't care what a force plate is or doesn't care what GPS is, or you might have something totally opposite. So much of it is being versatile in that, speaking with colleagues, or you're speaking as sportsmen. I feel like that's a skill that you don't realize, but the importance of that kind of translates to anywhere in beyond the field, whether it is strength and conditioning or beyond. So I said, I can speak to that super well, because that's literally exactly what you said. I was like, oh, I'm literally now, it's funny, all about connecting with people as well too. I mean, so much of, I say, my work was, I got pulled into Hawkin Dynamics because I worked at the company when I was a strength coach, got connected with them, kept that relationship, and now here I am as obviously like our director of customer success. So like you never know. So like yeah, anyone out there young, like reach out to people. Like it never hurts to make a phone call, shoot a text, social media now. That's something I wish I had done so much sooner. Was like just network, reach out to people, follow people. Hey, like this is super cool. And I feel like that's like to your point, like that's a great thing. So many people just don't realize the benefit of that long term. Yeah,
100%.
it was awesome. But yeah, like I said, again, the chat and the Q&A is open if anyone has any questions for Brenna here. I know we have a few minutes here, so if anyone has any questions they wanted to toss over their way. While we're waiting for a few questions to come in, all this is recorded and we'll send it out to everyone. So if you didn't catch either Brenna's contact info or Nick's, that will be in the recording, so you can reach out to them if you guys have any questions that you have after the fact on these. I actually had a question for you, Brenna. Do you guys, I know you said you have for the assignments, is it like a draw for where like you said like the interns like get an assignment? Is it like a draw, like hey, like you randomly get assigned, or do they get a like here's your top picks? Like how do you guys do that? Because I know you have said that a few times, so I was curious how that worked.
I write the sports we have. I usually do the ones that we actually have here so that, I don't have like our baseball guy trying to talk about rowing. It's not his specialty. But I just put the sports that are available in a hat, and then I have them reach into the hat and pull out their sports. Because the other thing I don't like is when it's like, well, I played soccer my whole life, I'm just going to program for soccer, and you never get to actually like be exposed to rotational sports or other types of training. So it's just kind of like copy and pasting what you did as an athlete or what you might have seen, the coach that you're working with that team do.
Right. No, I like that a lot. It's kind of like, hey, you have to learn to roll punches for whoever. Maybe you've never, yeah, like I worked with like squash and rowing, and I was like, I'd never had any contacts with them before, but like it was cool. No, that's great. We did have a question come in here. Can you use the NordBord and force frame with Hawkin force plates? I can potentially put off this as well. You can use both techs. The softwares are different, but you can utilize both. Obviously, you guys have a benefit. You guys both. Maybe you can kind of speak to. Obviously, there's benefits from both there. So I'll kind of let you elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can use anything you want. It's just a matter of what you're looking for. That's what I recommend making your first question. I think where people go wrong is they're like, ooh, we have force plates. We have to put this in all of our training. And it's like, no, what question are you trying to answer? And when you come from that approach, it gives you a lot more clarity of like what you're going to use and how. But absolutely, I just ran my teams through their postseason testing this last week, and we jumped on the force plate. We did an iso belt squat on the force plate, and then we went to the NordBord and the force frame right after. And we got a whole comprehensive report of what the soccer athlete as a whole looks like from their training this semester in the weight room. And then we as a support staff were able to sit down and have conversations, and you can send it off to the coaches too, and they can see where they ended up. So I think it's very much what do you want to test? What are the KPIs for that sport? What do you have available to you? Because also you can do a ton of stuff. I mean, our last presenter was talking about how much stuff you can do on a force plate. If you don't have a NordBord, you can get that same benefit with the force plate. So I think it's just what do you want to look at? What's at your disposal, and then making those two items match up.
Yeah, and I actually kind of want to note that you mentioned that like sometimes almost like people like the data and they send it off and don't actually look into it. Like you don't necessarily have to use those things. Obviously, they're great tools. I work for the company, but there's also so much benefit to like all the soft skills, having a coach's eye, being able to like relate to the athletes. Hey, do you have a rough day? Maybe we need to decrease volume because of that, not because you had a bad jump on the force plate. Like there's so many other tools. I think that sometimes people get caught up in like, oh, I have to have this tech. It's great. It's a tool in your toolbox. It's not kind of the end all be all, which I think is kind of an important thing to know too. Another question here, what is an emerging area in this field that we might not know is an area that we can go into as like a young individual in the field?
I think it's a good question. I think Depends on the level that you're at. There's always going to be a new hot topic. So I warn you not to always just chase the shiny thing in the hot topic, because there will always be something that pops up that it's like, oh, I should learn this. I think my advice is like, first, master the basics. Ask yourself again, write that list of, hey, I'm applying to jobs. What scares me the most? If you get a gymnastics job tomorrow, do you know what to do with them? Then maybe start looking into it and just kind of having an idea. I think there's a lot of good stuff out there, things like this. There's different webinars that will pop up and you'll kind of get a feel for what those flavors of the month are, because it is important to know for discussion. But I think the more important thing is like, what is your philosophy as a coach or a sports science practitioner? Stay true to those values and then start to dip your toe into some of those like newer areas popping up. I think the shoes that I sit in right now, like it's important to understand NIL in the world of college athletics, because that is drastically changing our landscape. So if you're a young coach, whoever asked the question, I think ask yourself, do I know enough about speed? Do I know enough about strength training? Do I know enough about, on-field loading in whatever area you're at? But if you're starting to get up to those higher positions, it's important to understand how that's affecting college athletics, because it is changing a lot of what we do. Training an athlete, for one kid transfers 4 years at every different school every 4 years, or maybe it's all about money and you need to be able to produce results and test things to show it. I think the other thing is very much return to play is heading into both the sports science and strength conditioning space, because we're only getting more resources and we're only getting smarter at how we can look at things and how we can measure that, area of an athlete's training. The kids are going to get hurt at some point, and I think how you bring them back and how you work as a collaborative team to bring them back in a smart way is not something that the field has perfected yet. I think some people do it great, but most places you go, everyone will say that it's something they need to improve and sharpen up. So starting to dip your toe into that space, I think, can only make you more valuable as you apply to other jobs, and because everyone will encounter return to play.
Yeah, I mean, Nick mentioned in his presentation, like the amount of money that like pro soccer teams lose when people are like injured because they're not playing. Like the best ability is availability. They always say like that return to play, like especially as so many sports, like there's so many more leagues coming out, NIL, like it'll cost people money to not be returned from sport, quote unquote. So yeah, I think you nailed it on the head there. And then also there's so much tech coming out, like force play technology was just coming about when I was in college. Like it didn't even really exist now, and now it's everywhere. Like so many things like VBT, that's huge now. Like when I first strength conditioning internship, we didn't have anything. Like we had no tech. We had like one rep, one unit, I think, in our entire facility, and it was like, this is a VBT device, and that was like one option. Like it was like so simple. Now there's hundreds out there. Like it's always growing. Like you said, like I think these free webinars, like jump on anything you can. More learning you can do, the better. You'll learn about things all the time. All right, I think that might have been our last question here. Thank you so much again, Brenna. A lot of information there. Like I said, a huge thank you to everyone jumped on. Thank you to our speakers, both Brenna and Nick, who I think had to hop off, so he's not going to bed at midnight his time. Like I said, there will be a recording that'll go out of this presentation, so you can always look back on it. A thank you to everyone for joining in this evening, and yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone again next year. So thanks so much again, everyone.